Welcome to NewYorkBIO's Virtual Breakfast Series, a digital program bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features serial entrepreneur Michael Aberman.
All right. Welcome to NewYorkBIO's Virtual Breakfast Series 2022 edition. I can't believe that. Who would have thought when we started this in April of 20 that we would still be doing this this much later. But as many of you have heard me say before, I am happy that this is something that seems to have stuck during the pandemic because it gives us the opportunity to have an in-depth conversation with one of our biotech leaders within New York and even across the nation. I am Jennifer Hawkes Bland, the CEO at NewYorkBIO, and we're very happy that you're here with us. This week, our esteemed guest is Dr. Michael Aberman, who has long been an important part of our New York biotech ecosystem. Full disclosure, he also sits on the New York Bio board. So please be nice to him in your questions because it might reflect poorly on me. Please, throughout our conversation today with Michael, put your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat, and Derek and I will monitor them as we go through the discussion. Otherwise, we are very happy to have you joining us, and we look forward to a lively conversation with Michael, and I will kick it over to Derek to start us off.
All right, good morning and happy 2022. And Jennifer, I guess being nice to him with questions probably goes for the two of us too. So we'll we'll kick it off in a good way. So Mike, it's so great to have you here with us. And just as a bit of a welcome, we usually start with an origin story. And when we were thinking about how to start the year, we thought about really the conditions we sit in as an industry and all the different perspectives we can bring, whether it's from the standpoint of an entrepreneur starting a company in these capital environments, whether it's from the standpoint of an investor, or even from the standpoint of a larger company thinking about where things sit in the therapeutic landscape. We kind of thought about what directions we could go in, and amazingly, you bring all of those perspectives to the table. So in so many ways, you're kind of the perfect way to start off the year. So we usually kick off things with a little bit of an origin story. So why don't we do that? Why don't you give our listeners a little bit of an idea of how you got to where you are today?
Sure. So first of all, thank you guys for having me, and feel free to ask me hard questions, or I'm ready. I've heard them all. I really appreciate being here. So thank you all also for attending. Hopefully, I won't bore you to sleep this early in the morning. But, my background: I'm a physician by training, and I finished my residency and didn't feel comfortable going into practice for the next 50 years of my life, and ended up going to Wharton's healthcare program, where it really opened my eyes to the things you could do. And I ended up going right into the biotech industry from business school at a small biotech company that was doing, I like to say, doing immuno-oncology back when immuno-oncologists were the outcasts in the department, sitting in the corner, long-haired hippies. And they all, of course, now run in companies and departments. I left there, however, after a couple of years to go to Wall Street, first at Morgan Stanley, where I was trained by the esteemed Dr. Steve Haar, who some of you might know, and we became really good friends. Left there, where I was an analyst for a number of additional years. And one of the companies I covered was Regeneron Pharmaceuticals, which was not a household name back then. Obviously, people in New York knew it. And we can talk a little bit about how I ended up on Wall Street, and Regeneron, it was no one really liked the name, and I sort of looked at it as quite undervalued, and ended up going there to lead investor relations and strategy. Strategy didn't mean much then, other than I was really lucky that they let me into the C-suite in terms of exposure and being on the senior management team right from the get-go. And was able to, be a front row seat to their growth and participate in helping the company through that period. Ended up growing to the strategy. It included building the business development function, ultimately strategic planning function, and so participating in all the deals that were done, both in licensing and out licensing transactions during that time. I was recruited out of there in 2017. The story is actually, I started getting recruited by some of the big Boston biotech firms that, I had a lot of esteem for, and they started telling me I'd be a good CEO. And for some reason, I believed them. And, once that sort of got in my head, I knew I'm stuck in New York for a variety of good reasons, but family being one of them. And I like New York, as you'll hear, and was ended up being recruited out by, I see Carlo was on the call. So Carlo from Versant to be a CEO of a traditional venture-backed company at a Lori Glimcher's lab called Quintus Therapeutics, and helped raise a Series A. As most of you may or may not know, it was tranched, which is what happens most of these times. Most of these cases, when you hear these big numbers, those are not typically they are. You don't get all that in the bank. But the reality is, I built the company from 3 or 4 people to 20, and advanced the technology to a go no go decision. Unfortunately, it was a no-go decision in terms of the lead asset. And I won't get too inside baseball, so don't worry, Carlo. But it just didn't end up being the right decision to turn the capital back to investors. I was able to actually get all the employees good jobs. A lot of them stayed in New York, thankfully. And I don't know if any are on the call, but Velastra has a space that I built out or helped start building out, and also a lot of my great employees who are, well, not my employees, my friends and colleagues, former colleagues, who are doing a great job there and as part of New York ecosystem. And that was the end of 2019. And so I was planning on doing a lot of skiing before doing my next gig, and a little virus got in the way of that. But I ended up being stuck at home and bored-ish, but quickly became unbored. I'm part of the NYU's Endless Frontier Labs mentoring program. I'm pretty close with the Weill Cornell folks, and I'm currently an entrepreneur residence there. I was an executive in residence at Columbia at that time, and just had got a lot of deal flow from those involvements, as well as from headhunters calling me, because I do think, fortunately for me, there's a lot in this period of time. There has been a tremendous amount of capital. There's a tremendous amount of good ideas. And one of the things that there's a shortage of us is people with experience management in biotech. So I've continued to have a lot of opportunity. I have a lot of friends in the venture world as well. And so I ended up taking board positions in a couple of early stage companies. One of which is out of Santa Cruz, California, called Unnatural Product, which is doing macrocycle, a novel approach to getting macrocycles into cells using machine learning, and it's an exciting program. Advising a company called NewYorkBIO, which is doing CRISPR for viral diseases and has a program in the clinic for HIV. I ended up on the board of a company out of the Columbia's tech program, which ended up being really outside my area of expertise, but with a CEO that I really like, and he's doing testing for a novel testing technology for COVID. We thought he missed the boat, this past summer in June and July, because he was a little behind. It's like, oh, sorry, it doesn't seem like it's gonna pan out. Turns out that was wrong. And now he's doing, not only are they doing a lot of testing for New Jersey, and that's a nice profitable business, but it's moving along a novel technology, which would be a bedside PCR test, which I think is going to go beyond COVID. What else am I doing? And then, of course, I'm starting a company, and so out of Weill Cornell, which is and I'm also advising another New York company called Immunai, which I met through the Endless Frontier Lab. And when I first met them, it was a very small, low, small company trying to raise a first round, and they recently raised over $200 million at $1 billion valuation. So it's really been exciting to watch them grow, and they have a very interesting technology in single cell sequencing the immune system. So, it's been really fun being an advisor and sort of angel investor, and But now I'm thinking about going back in it as a manager. So
did you
Yeah.
ski at all?
I did. I got the February ski trip in where I was telling everybody who would listen to me that the sky's about to fall, and they all thought I was crazy. I had an earlier January trip, so a January and February trip, but
Okay.
then my March trip got canceled. So I got about 10 days in, which
Okay.
is pretty good.
Yeah. You were
Well,
telling
the
everyone,
virus has impacted.
yeah, this guy was falling. Well, I guess at that point, 14-year-old was telling me what he was reading in Hong Kong that I needed to suck up on toilet paper. So I think you and he would get along.
Yeah, no, it's funny because when I was an analyst, one of my first companies helped launch coverage on was MedImmune and Genentech and I think it was MedImmune. We did a lot on avian flu at the time. And I am also from Toronto, so SARS came along. So I've said the sky is falling a couple times. So I was really waiting for it. And so at first I was so excited that it was happening. But then as it evolved, it became obviously clear that we weren't going to manage it very well. And it's been very surreal to live through something, where I almost felt like I was expecting it for so long. Obviously didn't think it was, who knows what it was going to look like, what it was going to be, but it's been very disappointing, sadly. But a source of pride for all of us, I should imagine, which we can also talk about in our industry, really being the solution. I think that's helped it for many, many, many reasons.
I think we tend to hit that week in and week out, and we've had the good fortune to have people on this program who kind of have come at things from every different angle of the industry, and you really find so many positives in just about every corner of the industry and life sciences in general. Whether it's folks that turned around everything in their lab to try and do stuff on COVID. Certainly Regeneron, as the story goes, basically, Len and George basically turned to their antibody team and said, "You will do nothing else except this until we get it." And there's stories like that throughout the industry. So, it's certainly I think a point of pride. And this industry works really hard anyway, and it always works to save patients' lives. And this was kind of the moment that everybody was really called to step up, and it's been pretty amazing to see. It really has.
Yeah.
So if you think about where we sit now, if you were to think about the hats that you wear, and you mentioned before the amount of capital available, and I'm going to come back to your Quintus point, because I don't want to lose that, but I do want to start with just the general market piece. If you're going to put your Wall Street hat on for a minute, what do you think about 2022, right? If you're thinking about the broad industry, what do you think about this with the amount of capital available, and that the stock market for biotech is not in a great place after the end of last year? What would your analyst hat tell you to think about this?
Yeah, no, and so I knew you were going to ask this question, so I went and read some of my former colleagues' reports and try to get up to date. I mean, I've been in the private markets now for a few years, but I still think a lot about the public markets because they're related. And it really was a very hard year for biotech specific funds and managers last year. And one of the companies I'm advising is in the process of raising a Series B with a hope for a crossover, Excision Bio. And so, you saw that, right? It's at the end of the year when the XBI was down 20% and the broader markets were up 20%.
Yeah.
It was a tremendous amount of underperformance. Now, put that in context, and also I think 3/4, so 75% of the IPOs in 21 were below their IPO price.
Yep.
So put that in context, though, some of us with a little gray hair have been doing this for longer, have been through cycles. And I think the context of that is that, in 2020, the average IPO company was down 20%. In 2020, the average IPO was up 100%. 3/4 or some 30% of them were up 100% or more. And so obviously, and this bull market for biotech had been going on in spite of for a number of years. And so there's been a lot of capital coming in from the private company side. A lot of venture capital has been putting a lot of money to work, was able to get a lot of companies out in 2020 very successfully. That allowed a tremendous number of companies to come out in 2021. Now, I didn't pay attention to, there's so many, I don't really even know how analysts can keep track anymore of all the companies. But, what often happens is, some of the quality measures start coming down. And by quality measures, I'm not necessarily questioning the science, but, things go earlier and earlier. And to be a public market company, you need a certain amount of catalysts. I always used to tell people, be careful what you wish for when I was a public markets person, to be going from the private to public markets, because, you're all of a sudden always talking to investors. Now, in many cases, you are anyways in the private markets, but it's a different amount of pressure. And, some of these companies weren't ready. And so you had a little bit of that hangover. Fortunately, it didn't really affect the private markets that much, right? The number of private capital that happened continued to go really high. And in some ways, while the IPO class of 2021 didn't necessarily perform well, it doesn't necessarily mean the private early investors didn't do well. And right, so if you think about the economics of it, they may not have exited completely, but they get it on their books, they get out, and they'll live to fight another day. I think a lot of the public market companies, you now have a situation, we'll see what happens in terms of capital starts running out. If you were one of the early 2021 or late 2020 companies, you're constantly needing to raise money. If you've been successful and modicum of success, you need to raise, there's such a capital intensive industry. This is going to lead to a couple of things. One is, I think there's going to be consolidation. There's going to be, which means M&A for certain companies, and the large companies have huge coffers, right? If you think about how much money,
a lot of cash on the balance sheet,
Pfizer has made on their, they spent a lot of time divesting and rationalizing, and now all of a sudden they've got huge amounts of cash. I think that's going to be very exciting to see how they deploy that and how they think about that. But other companies are in the same position. And when markets go like this, there's opportunities. I think there's also been, in my opinion, in some of the industry, some of the technologies I've seen, I think of cell therapy as an example, and maybe gene therapy is an example of this too, but cell therapy more so. There's so much excitement around this new technology, and rightfully so. There's been seeing tremendous progress, but people were able to go public on a specific technology novelty, whereas they don't have the full suite of manufacturing, et cetera. And I think there's going to be opportunities to package companies together that will make the companies stronger, because maybe not all it's not how it's all planned out and how people thought their companies will grow, but I think you may have a good target company that went public or was successful because they had a novel target for a CAR T, and that's really exciting, but they didn't have any novel technology per se, coupled with some novel technologies, coupled with some manufacturing technologies, and now all of a sudden you can put these together, and I think you're going to have your company's better off for that.
Yeah, you basically you have the opportunity to almost assemble a more complete company.
And so I think it's going to be exciting, and the truth is, a lot of the venture firms have a lot of money still, and so they can play a role in it. They have portfolio companies, some of which will be struggling, and they'll have to make decisions and hard decisions about what companies should go together and whatnot. There's public companies that are going to be running out of cash, and how they going to, and don't have catalysts, and they may think about, okay, what can we do? And so I think for someone like myself, who likes strategy and thinks about strategy, it's a fun time, it can be a fun time when things are harder. And so it'll be interesting to see. I'm excited to see how 2022 plans out, but I'm, continue to be bullish about our industry as a whole. If you look again, I saw the note that came out this morning. There was a record number of NDAs last year. So the actual fundamentals of our business remain really strong. I mean, the FDA's got a leader back in place and is proved, even in the tumultuous time of last year, was able to do a record number of approvals. The amount of technologies that are advancing that I've seen over the past couple of years is, in so many different areas, is going to lead to new breakthroughs. I think there's a greater appreciation by people, general people, about what our industry does. And even with the continued constant headwinds of drug pricing, which I have strong opinions about, but we'll see what happens. I think even with those negative headlines, I think what happened with COVID is going to hopefully last for a while. And maybe some of the things that I think were a little more negative, in my opinion, like, the Biogen Alzheimer's fiasco will be outshined by the positives of the industry, right? And I think that's a good thing for all of us.
I think so. You've mentioned not only the amount of cash on the balance sheet with the larger biopharmas, but the other important point is all of the venture funds basically re-upped, right? Everybody raised new funds. So I think one of the big differences, if you think about the last time you had kind of a depressed market like this, if you go all the way back to 2008, 2009, I think that was coupled with a much less healthy private investment market, and we don't have that now. Right. So I think the dynamics will be hopefully different this time. And, I think the pace of private company creation is hopefully gonna stay high. And, just to kind of transition here. So, okay, if you put your hat on as an entrepreneur and as an advisor, how do you look at where things sit now? So maybe you eventually have a public market correction, or maybe it's slightly more difficult to be public. But there is an environment where there's a lot of capital available. Like we said, we now have kind of more modalities in the toolbox, and I think the venture industry has shown that they're willing to look at new modalities. So you think about mRNA, you think about companies that are drugging RNA, and a whole bunch of different platforms that people have looked at. It seems like, in terms of early technology and new ventures, it almost seems like a bit of a wide open, the world is your oyster type of environment.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, as an entrepreneur, I think you're right. Like, I think there's a lot of positives. I think on the one hand, if you're a later stage company looking to go public and or crossover, you have to be cognizant of the fact that the public market folks are licking their wounds a little bit and now wondering, okay, what do I have to, where will I have to put money in secondaries for my companies? And to be quite honest, some of the venture firms are also thinking about, okay, I thought I was going to be able to exit. Let's see what happens with the IPO market. I may need to reserve some capital to keep my existing portfolio going. Yeah. So you have to make sure you manage your board and their expectations about how easy it will or will not be to raise funds, right? Which is always a challenge. But there are a lot of funds for good companies. And like you said, there's novel technologies. And like you said, like the ability to go after the quote undruggable target space with novel technologies, whether it's protein degraders, whether it's mRNA, whether it's gene therapy, whether it's macrocycles that can be permeable, a little plug for unnatural products. There's all kinds of new modalities and ways of, synthetic biology ways of going after undruggable targets, which is also really exciting. There's new ways, looking at immunology, new ways of discovering targets and understanding the immune system using the new single cell technologies and the whole suite of technologies. That's going to open up new insights to new biology. So I don't know if I'm answering your question because I got a little distracted there, but I think there's a lot for entrepreneurs to continue to be excited by,
So if we, go ahead, Jennifer.
Oh, yeah, I was just gonna say, we got a question from the audience that I think fits in here. It's looking at, here's the question. It says, what do you see as the value proposition of pharma as the tools of democracy discovery are becoming more democratized? And companies often, I'm not sure I agree with this, but often have plenty of capital to take assets all the way to commercialization. Are smaller companies, if they have the capital, do they need the pharma partnerships? And how do you think that'll play out in the future?
Yeah, so I mean, I occasionally give talks on about business development and the reasons. I think business development and licensing is going to continue to be an important lifeblood of our industry. And even if you, and so you're right. For a while now, it used to be early on, you would say big pharma partnerships are sort of validation of your technology.
Yeah.
And as investors became more and more savvy, and you had more and more PhDs and ex-pharma people making investment decisions, it became less important to get that sort of validation. And so, there was a time when you could argue that the decision some of the farmers were making almost was an anti-validation, but I wouldn't say that now. But the capitals are first of all, even if you have the money to do quote unquote go commercialize, you're never going to be for a company to do their first asset and commercialize globally. That's so unlikely and questionable. I also don't know if it's what the industry needs. And even if you can commercialize, and having seen this and been part of commercializations, both as independently at Regeneron and as a partnership. And again, a lot of my views are colored by my experiences there, but why build? You can get the same economics oftentimes from partnering than you would from building. Don't underestimate the costs and overhead and long-term implications and complications of building commercialization. So yes, for the ultra rare disease drugs having watched a company like Alexion and Celgene build global infrastructure. There are opportunities where that could be the right decision, but so often it's not. I mean, Regeneron, I still don't think sells globally any of their products, and it's been pretty darn successful. And have they less money on the table? I don't know, maybe, but I don't think so. You can get economics where it's just as well that you have a partner selling globally. And there's advantages to that, particularly when you're talking about the Asia markets, where there's so much about being a local that you can that benefits you from commercializing. So I guess the answer is I think big pharma still has a role. They also continue to have a role in terms of clinical development. When you have these large, small companies are gonna, yes, CROs can play a role in that, but again, it's all a question of how you want to grow your organization and what your strengths are. And if your strengths are on the research side, novel drug discovery, and my view is that's where small companies really shine, and that's where whereas when you start getting to the industrialization of clinical trials and commercialization, it's a different skill set, different management skill set. And it may not even be what you want to bring into a company in order to keep its culture the same. And so,
it's
a whole different game.
Even large pharma will partner for ex-US rights. I mean, right? Like, so there are large volume drugs and pharmaceuticals that are distributed differently across the globe by even large pharma partners, right? I mean, so it's.
Well, I've had that experience where, at Regeneron, and it's all public, we had a great partner in Bayer globally for EYLEA. But, when you partner globally, you realize that, well, in Japan, you need a third partner. So we ended up having to do a three-way deal between ourselves, Bayer, and Santen. And, I think, again, I'm not there anymore, but I think that collaboration went incredibly well. Santen has done a great job commercializing EYLEA in Japan, and I just don't think it would have been as good without them. And so to your point, which is why another reason that I advocate regional deals instead of global deals.
Yeah.
In some cases, particularly Asia.
Yeah.
It's funny. I think the commercialization aspect of everything in biopharma is really underappreciated, probably because the discovery and clinical stuff is so hard, right? I think the general thinking when just from people that don't think about it terribly much is that, oh, well, if you go through clinical trials and you demonstrate that your drug is better, then magically after it's approved, the drug goes everywhere and the money just comes in and everything is fine. You forget the fact that you actually have to build the thing where the people actually bring it to the places to get it to the actual patients. I think it's one of those things where the top of the mountain is so far away that everybody, rightfully looks at all of the big challenges as amazing things. But, eventually you do, there is another step and there is another piece of the mountain. It's just that people don't often get there.
Yeah, and then when you do collaborations and you commercialize, there's ways to, as best you can, depending on your leverage and what, of negotiating where you may have some control over pricing or how the sales go. So you don't necessarily have to have the sales force and build that infrastructure in order to have control over your baby or asset. So.
Yeah. So we've actually got we've got a couple of good questions here. We've already talked a little bit about the M&A front. So we got a question from John Pennant asking about M&A and licensing activities. Do you see that kind of pace increasing, if you will? You mentioned this a little bit before.
Yeah, no, I mean, always, there's always a dual process when you're doing an IPO. And actually now it's become even more, and we didn't mention this, but SPACs, and again, as companies that have gone public run into pressure, there'll be reverse mergers. And so, there's, and M&A is the alternative. And so as management, when going through those processes, you want to have, to get the best valuation, you want to have all these different pathways. And in different markets, different pathways win out differently. Obviously, when the markets are easier on the IPO front, the big pharma will walk away and be like, I can't compete with the IPO. That's going to change. And I think you're going to see a lot more companies saying, well, I'm going down this IPO road. I'm doing test the waters. The waters aren't that inviting.
Right.
Pharma over here is interested. Maybe this is a better way to go. So I definitely think that's going to be a part of the future for sure.
Yeah.
Right. And I think a lot of boards will probably feel the same way.
Well,
yeah, I think the biopharma BD folks are going to have a busy year. I mean,
yep,
it's a good thing.
Well, and let's be frank, it is the board's responsibility at each company to evaluate the best path forward, right? I mean, and whatever that may be.
Correct.
I mean, that is as the lawyer here, that is their fiduciary responsibility. We actually had another, well, let's stick with this sort of, public markets IPO question. We had a question from Arthur Klausner. He said, platforms, in quotes, tend to dominate IPOs in exuberant markets, as in 2021, but products have led the way most of the rest of the time. The question is, do you think we're going to go back to companies with phase 2 results being the only biotech companies that can access public markets? Basically, are we going to go back to needing later stage results in order to IPO?
It's a great question. And, having grown up on Wall Street during the time period where if you didn't have clinical data, don't go public.
Right.
But, there's, with the success of mRNA and some of the other companies that went public in 2020 on platforms, I'm not sure that that's necessary. I think, like anything, it depends. I think there are always, what I look for in companies that I want to advise and take on or do things with. I like, the combination of a platform with a proof of concept out of that platform, typically, which would be a product. Whether it has to be phase 2 data, it depends on the indication in terms of what the killer experiment is and how late it has to be. But I think this is exactly what happens when the markets become more choppy for IPOs. Is investors start looking for sure things and little lower risk, which means further advanced proof of concept. I still think there will be room for super exciting new technologies that have tremendous promise to access the public markets, but it will become harder, fewer, if this continues the way it is. So I think it's a really good point. I don't think we're gonna get to a point where it's, universal, oh, you need phase two. I think there's too much capital out there. There's too many companies already have gone through this way, so that I don't think we're gonna go back to the time when, and I think part of that also, though that time, again, it's the sophistication of the investors being able to feel like they're able to evaluate technology and probability of successes before you can make an investment decision. And I think people feel comfortable making those earlier stage decisions, and will continue to do so.
Yeah, you actually started to answer a little bit of a question that was before that I flagged for now, and this is a good time. So one of our listeners had said, when you decide to sit on a board or act as an advisor, what are some of the big aspects you consider when you're vetting the company? And I would also say, what are some of the big things you look for in what you can bring to a company? So how do you think about that situation in terms of both your time and where you want to go, and what kind of companies you think you can help the most?
Yeah, no, and I think my experiences with Quentis really help inform that in terms of what I thinking about, what I want to do. And I think if you look at the commonalities of the companies I get involved with, is I'm looking for a platform. And part of this happens to my strength. My strengths are in partnering, capital markets, raising money, and strategy, thinking strategically. Okay, which way do you want to go? Which indication should you go after? What should you do with technology? How far do you want to go before you partner? How do you want to partner? And, I want to be in companies where, that type of decision-making is happening or going to happen. So, it's a combination of things that I'm interested in, science, that I love being around really good science and interesting science. It has to be a platform, and it has to be somewhere where I feel like I can add value. And lastly, it has to be people who want my advice. I'm not being forced on companies by a board per se. And so I like to go places where, the CEO is interested in hearing what I have to say and listening. So it's that combination. And there's a lot of companies out there that fit that bill. Probably more companies than I can work with, for sure.
Yeah. Now, if I could just figure out how to do that with my kids, where they want my advice.
My kids don't want my advice
do
either.
that with kids? Oh,
Is there a personal translation there?
Well, that's exactly it. No one listens to me at home, so I figure I at least at work want to go somewhere where someone might actually listen to me.
Yeah, it's a household board position. We'd be more than happy to have you extend your strategic insights to our kids. So to go back for a second, I think one of the really great things about Quentis is you ended up building a fantastic team, and which has now gone on to other things. But I also wanted to make sure we publicly gave you credit for something that doesn't always happen. So as Quentis was dissolving or whatever, I know that you and others spent a ton of time making sure that the team you built had places to land. And I know that you guys worked really, really hard to make that happen. I think that's rare. I know of other companies that have shut down, and I can think of one in particular where they basically just closed the doors and told everybody to go away. So that's rare, and I wanted to give you credit for that, because I thought that was a really great thing to do. And I think that means a lot to everybody that worked for you, and I would hope that means a lot to everybody else in the industry. So you can call that a question that you want. I
really appreciate that, and I do think it's important. our reputations and our I want to do this again. I want to have people to work with me again. It's more important to me than other aspects. I think also part of my perspective, you can try to keep going and do each last experiment with a hope that it's going to find something and spend your last dollar. And sometimes that's the right thing to do, but oftentimes, you can be blinded a little bit by your own, your love for your own project. And that sometimes happens when the founders are running the company per se, and which is completely understandable. But I'm following the science. I'm really hopeful. The technology also went back to the founders, and I'm hearing that they're out again with some new data and potential new indications. And there's nothing I would like to hear more from is, a new company with the same compounds technologies. The science wasn't ready for what we thought, the timeline that the investors thought, and we all thought was going to be the case. And so heading it back to academia and to keep going is a difficult decision, but, and it was hard in retrospect, it was probably the right decision. Again, one of my regrets about the whole situation is that we had a good team. And I think there could have been an opportunity, with the new company I'm starting right now, I'd love to have that same team together. And ironically, it's technology that we looked at when we were there. So it could have been that, and it would be much further advanced today had we done that. But, it wasn't the right group of investors for that technology, which is also understandable. And, we'll get the right group of investors around at this time, and hopefully it'll be successful.
Yeah, it's funny. Nothing ever starts in the same conditions twice, right?
Yeah.
The investors are different, the people are different, and if you just think about company formation, it's a group of people that were ready to jump on the spaceship all at the same time, and that doesn't necessarily, those conditions don't necessarily happen again. But the nice thing is that, and we can kind of transition a little bit to a more New York centric topic here, is now we've got I think we've got a lot of people that are more seasoned. I think we have a really good kind of scientific substrate, and we're getting an even better entrepreneurial substrate around here. So I would imagine that the conditions for this have only gotten better in our own backyard, and I think everybody's excited about that.
I agree. I mean, as you know, I've been a big fan of New York. I get, I still get a lot of calls, and I explore other opportunities. You never know what's going to happen when you're trying to start a company, whether or not it's going to get off the ground, et cetera, et cetera. And there's more and more opportunity in New York, which is great.
Yep. So when you think about things now, you're working with, you're an executive in residence at Columbia. You're working with Cornell. What are some of the things? Let me ask this differently. How long do you usually take in terms of thinking about a new opportunity? What is kind of the timeline on the process, right? Because you can't. I imagine you don't kind of read a cool paper and sign the contract the next day, right? So what does your process look like for that? How long do you usually spend before you say this is something I really want to spend a lot of time on?
Yeah, no, and I'm no longer an executive residence at Columbia. That was a term that's done, but
Okay.
It's no, I'm not reading papers and thinking of that. It's much more, companies come along, and you start off with meeting them and having a few meetings before anything comes of it, right? And getting to know the management team and the technology, and if there seems to be a good fit, like they're interested in hearing what I have to say, and I feel like I can help, and the technology is interesting to me, and then there'll be a process of going under confidentiality, really understanding getting to understand the technology better, and you go down that road. I'm very, very lucky. I don't have to rush. I didn't have to rush into anything, and so it's a very fortunate position to be in. I recognize how lucky I am for that. And so, I haven't, and I didn't feel the need to. COVID also played a role. I'm stuck at home. To rush into something also didn't make sense. So it's really a two-way, long-term, discussion.
Yeah. And what are you, I mean, as you said you're committed to New York. That's good.
That's good.
What are you seeing? And I a little bit harkening back to when you were helping or supporting your staff, right, at Quintus to find new jobs. What are you seeing with the evolution of the New York ecosystem? Because you've been here a while and you've seen, I think, different iterations. So what are you seeing with that now?
I mean, it's so different. I mean, when I left business school and I was at my, in college, the only reason I went to Wall Street was one of the main reasons, was that I couldn't find a biotech job in New York. Like there was 2 or 3 companies only, and I wanted a business development job, which are small teams. And so I really, there wasn't, if I wanted to stay in biotech and I wanted to be in New York, Wall Street was really the only choice I have. I think that's completely different now. There's so many companies and opportunities in New York, whether it's with big companies like Regeneron and others now that are taking their place, whether it's, a company like, Calliope, which is successful and going to the next stage, whether it's Immuni, whether it's, Velastra, whether it's coming to work for someone like me and being super entrepreneurial. There's just so much more opportunity. You've got what Deerfield's doing at Cure. You've got NewYorkBIO, which is a company that I also work with for a time, that's building all kinds of companies. Whether it's, Alexandria, which is, been so incredibly helpful for the New York ecosystem, and now what they're doing in Columbia and now in Queens. There's just tremendous, it's so much, I can honestly tell people who are in New York and don't have the luxury that I have, that need jobs, that you can find something. If it's important to you, you can find something in New York. There will be something exciting for you to do in New York. Whereas in the past, I think, I'd be a little more, chance of getting New York are slim. You better look at San Francisco or Boston. I think there's just so much more opportunity in the tri-state area.
Yeah. I think one of the nice things about all of the incubators is, it brings a lot of companies under one umbrella. And I think it brings a lot of visibility. I think before that, you kind of had to know, who was where and kind of have this mental list in your head about where these startups were popping up. But now, at least with the incubators, they're all on their websites. They announce them when they get in. You can find them because they're all under one roof. And now you add it up, and there's
not to mention that the NewYorkBIO now has such talented leadership that there's a place to go, and not to be shameful plug, but I think it's true. I think you guys have done an incredible job, and even events like this with 100 attendees, which is a weekly basis, is fantastic, and it just shows that there's so much going on, and I think hopefully more and more companies learn about NewYorkBIO and hopefully join. There's going to be more of a place to go to say, okay, well, hey, NewYorkBIO is your job board. Who do you know? You can always call Derek. He knows everybody, and so just ask him what's going on. He'll find you a job. Is that right? Do you get a commission? No.
I do it free. It's 100% successful. And my commission fee is 1 beer. If it ever works. And I haven't collected on that throughout the 2 years of the pandemic. So I guess 2023 is going to be a really crazy year. But we have 9 minutes. You can continue talking about how wonderful we are. You can explore the studio space on that one. I think one of the nice things is, I think you represent a group of people that I think are exceptional diplomats for both the New York area and biotech in general. And it's kind of, I would say you and Nancy Thornberry and a lot of the CEOs that were in, kind of that crop of companies that, were either, Versant, Accelerator Corp, those guys that were among kind of the first to raise these larger Series A rounds in and around New York. And just to give you a lot of credit there, it seems like you and a lot of people that were in that boat really, took that mantle seriously. And now I think we're all benefiting from that. You have more capital has flown in, and you guys did such a good job in putting teams together and really kind of putting a good foot forward to say, hey, yeah, you can actually build a company in New York. You can get great people to come work for you in New York. And I think we owe a lot to the way that you guys approach that, because I think, without that, I don't know that we would be in the same kind of situation that we are now.
Yeah, and to be fair, it's just true. I mean, New York, I was able to build a good team. I mean, I think it would have been a lot better if Tuentis had been successful, obviously, my proselytizing, but hopefully we'll have another chance at it. And again, there's also Scorpion and others that are out there now starting. So I'll plug my friend, Dr. Hoos, and others, and, more stuff happening. But, I think you can find talent here. There's tons of academic institutions where you have postdocs to hire from. There's a ton of big pharma and big biotech, sorry, Regeneron, but people tend to eventually want to move on oftentimes. And so there's tons of talent there. And, Europe and Israel, New York is a lot more convenient for a lot of people. It's a much more multicultural, international city for people to want to live. And if you have partners who need opportunities, there's lots of more opportunities for partners, I think, than Boston. That's not to say they don't exist in Boston, but then you get stuck rooting for the Red Sox, which is awful.
It's really terrible.
And
the city doesn't have many drawbacks, but that's a huge one. The Celtics are okay, but the Red Sox,
I don't know. Knicks are playing them on Thursday. We'll see how it goes.
Oh, you Northerners with your professional team. It's all about college football in the South.
There's no, we don't have any of that.
You also were talking earlier about the fact that you're ready to do it again, right? You're ready to build another company. One criticism, if you will, that I've heard about New York as our evolution, right, has advanced with earlier stage biotech, is that first we didn't have space. Now we have space, right? Then, or I guess first it was people didn't want to stay here. They wanted to go somewhere else. It was too expensive. And then we didn't have space. And then it was, we don't have this flywheel, right, of early stage CEOs that are willing to do it again, that can get backed, right, by finance. And I think you were showing us the evolution of that, right?
We'll see. I haven't got back yet, but yes.
Yeah.
If anyone's out there listening, call me, email me.
So how do you see that growing in New York? And then are there other things that we also need to focus on to encourage companies to grow and stay here?
I think, first of all, on the expense side, San Francisco and Boston are equally, if not more so, expensive.
Yeah.
I really think the real estate thing has really been helped out. I think that, things that can encourage development of management talent is always helpful. I think that's one of the things I like, about what I try to do is helping, first-time CEOs. The reality is now so many companies are, because of the proliferation, first-time CEOs are pretty common, even in Boston. And so, it's giving people chances in New York. There's a lot of, good next level folks, Celgene, coming out of Celgene that was acquired, and other, companies that have been successful. And I think it's just giving people a shot, making sure there are, people on the board that can help first-time CEOs, which I think is a lesson that I learned. I think you really need a strong chairman or who can be an advocate for a first-time CEO to help them. Those things would be great. I think that'd be, a network of strong chairman to help attract and say, hey, if you come to New York, we'll back you and be there for your executive chairman. That'd be great, in terms of having that kind of support system. I think that's really would be useful now that I think about it. These are some of the ideas, but again, it's continue doing what we're doing. EDC's done a great job, etc. So
definitely.
I think,
I don't know. It's funny. We talk about this. We talk about this a lot, and I think there was a lot of work done 10 years ago that is really kind of manifested now. It's kind of a decade-long overnight success, if you will. And like so many things in biotech, right? People put in all of the hard work for years, and all anybody really reads is the number on the press release after the funding is in the bank, right? They tend to forget about all the hard work that went into that. But a lot of the industry is putting one foot in front of the other, and you do that for 10 years, and then something goes right, and everybody thought it was easy for the rest of the way. So it's funny, you said before, and just to come back to this, I think it makes a really good point, right? The scientific team behind Quintus is now kind of coming back around after doing more work, and science doesn't stop at bad results. And every scientist from the first year PI straight up to a Nobel laureate has had experiments that don't work the first time. And I think people recognize good science for the types of the dedication and the perseverance to actually keep going and keep pounding at the question. The results don't necessarily always come when you want them to, but it's that sticking to it and trying to figure out the problem where we make real steps against biology.
Yeah, and by the way, in the industry, that there's so many examples of drugs that have passed through several hands before they end up being successful. So it means it has to have the right people behind it that want to believe in certain things, the right investors behind it. And sometimes, if it doesn't work out in one situation, it needs to go back and keep going. So I agree with you 100%, Derek.
All right. Well, we've got about 2 minutes left, Mike, or now it's a minute and a half. So give us a couple closing thoughts for 2022.
Yeah, no, I think, first of all, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I hope it was helpful for people on listening. And, I think there's just tons of reason to be optimistic. Despite Omicron, I think we're going to have a bad, or are having a tougher winter. And I really feel bad for our healthcare colleagues that are faced with the brunt of this, and appreciate them. And so if any are on the call, thank you. But we'll get through it. And I think by the spring, we really should have, a much brighter future where, this will be more endemic than pandemic. And I think things are going to come back to normal. And I think biotech is going to play an important role and continue to play an important role. So I'm excited to see where all the technologies go and how we can help patients. I actually was a patient for the first time this year, and had a little bit of a health situation that's all resolved, but you realize how important these advances are. Like I was able to get some of the drugs that I worked on, and procedures that wouldn't be there but for all my colleagues in their industry. And so I thank all of you out there that are working in this industry. I constantly do, for doing that. I appreciate it. I'm really, part of what makes me fortunate, God forbid one of us gets COVID and gets sick, there's Pfizer's drug out there to help, or Regeneron's antibody, or AstraZeneca's now with Omicron. I'm sure they're going to come up with an Omicron version. So that makes me sleep better. And so, I'm very optimistic.
Well, we are grateful to you for joining us today and participating. And we're thankful to all our listeners. Michael's talk will also be posted on YouTube in the future. So if you wanted to listen again or take notes maybe that you didn't get to take, you'll be able to access it on our YouTube channel. Thank you, everyone. We were so glad to kick off 2022 with you, Michael, and we'll see you all next week.
Great.
Thanks,
Happy New Year,
everybody.
everybody.
Okay. Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.
Thank you for tuning in to New York Bio's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on New York Bio, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.